So, yeah, having been a customer of this, I understand the importance. And I understand the importance with the threat to the potential threat to those systems in the space from potential adversaries who have got all sorts of systems up there. And I know what it's like if that gets taken away from us. And that's why I'm passionate about this, because I don't want that to happen.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. After 4 weeks, the U.S. Space Force concluded its largest service-wide exercise called Resolute Space 2025. And it's not been a Guardian U.S.-only event. Space Operations Command says it's included allies and partners from as many as a dozen nations. Now, some of these nations have officers serving in leadership roles with leadership responsibilities and functions within the U.S. Space Force. This ostensibly allows these integrated officers to also reach back to their nation's militaries and better coordinate U.S.-led multinational space operations that support the joint force. According to Space Operations Command, the lessons from this exercise are being captured with a particular focus on developing a force design and force development and force employment that integrates the capabilities and personnel of allies and partners with those of the U.S. Space Force. And there's now a new Space Force International Partnership Strategy that explains with some detail how the U.S. and its allies and partners in space will work together. The officer who has led the development of this strategy happens to be a Royal Air Force 3-star and this week's guest. I'm talking about Air Marshal Paul Godfrey. He's a fighter pilot, but he's space-minded. He has served as the director of the 609th Air Operations Center in Udeid, which is responsible for coalition air and space power across the Middle East. And he's also Britain's first commander of U.K. Space Command. He's now on loan to the Space Force Headquarters Command Staff and is the Assistant Chief of Space Operations for future concepts and partnerships. Now, before we get to our conversation, I want to make a brief announcement for the Space ISAC's Value of Space Summit. It's coming soon, and it starts on September 8th. And in fact, it's opening with yours truly. We're going to be talking about space, cutting-edge technology, and national security before a standing room-only audience. Yep, it's already sold out, but you can catch the live stream. Just go to stackstalk.io and get the details. Now, here's our conversation with Air Marshal Godfrey. Hello, Godders. Welcome to the Downlink podcast.
Hey, Laura. Pleasure to be here on a not-so-sunny day here in D.C.
No, it's very London-esque, isn't it? I mean, this is like summer when I lived in London. It was always overcast.
Yeah, but you guys have air conditioning here. That makes a difference.
It's true, but it sort of reminded me of London, I have to say. It really does. With or without air conditioning,
For the listeners,
right?
It's a cloudy day.
So now, undeniably, you are well known in this part of the E-Ring and the Space Force and the Royal Air Force. But it would be great if we could start off this discussion with you taking a moment to introduce yourself, like what you do and where you do it.
Well, Air Marshal Paul Godfrey, 34th year in the Royal Air Force. I was a fighter pilot for most of that, and in the last 5 years, I've been incredibly lucky. You always wonder what you're going to do when you hang up your flying gloves, your flying boots. And I fell into space, which has been amazing. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but right now, my job title is I'm the Assistant Chief of Space Operations, which means I work directly for General Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations, for future concepts and partnerships. And ultimately, that came about because he came over to me at a conference about 18 months ago and said, what are you doing? When you finished, I was in UK Space Command, commanding that at the time. I was coming up to the end. He said, how do you fancy coming to work for me? neither of us, I think, thought that was going to come off, but actually some amazing work from people here in the building. 6 months later, here I was as the Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships, and working with an awesome team, one of which who's sat near us right now, my Sergeant Steve Zavertnik, Z. Who we then developed, and I think we'll talk about this, so I won't give the game away right now, developed sort of 3 lines of effort. But ultimately, it's about integrating partners and allies into the United States Space Force and the architecture of space in the future. So it's amazing. It's a real honor to be here.
Well, it's a real honor to have you on the podcast. And please do forgive me. I am going to ask you what would be considered probably a very pedestrian question, but that is so that we can bring everybody along with us, because I'd love it if we could take this opportunity to unpack the rank and office, starting with the rank, right? Not everyone understands what an Air Marshal is inside the UK, let alone the United States, right? Sort of a sad statement, but if you went to the Brixton Road, for instance, right, where I used to live, or here on Wisconsin Avenue, I don't think there's really anybody who could actually give the definition. So why don't we help them out? What does that mean, Air Marshal?
I think here in the US, definitely, and abroad, people understand the concept of a general and a 1-star, a 2-star, 3-star, and a 4-star general. And for me, I'm a equivalent to a 3-star general. The equivalents back home are 1-star in the Royal Air Force is an Air Commodore, a 2-star is an Air Vice Marshal, a 3-star is an Air Marshal, and a 4-star is an Air Chief Marshal. And certainly one thing I always joke about, maybe we'll get into my sort of backstory, but certainly my book title will probably end up being From Spitfires to Space, the Accidental 3-Star.
That's a great title.
No one steal that's listening, by the way.
Well, and if so, you know how to find me, and I will be representing him. So now let's get into the office. You are the Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships. So what does that actually mean in the grand scheme of the United States Space Force? And what I mean by that is, what is the portfolio in a nutshell?
Yeah, so as I said, it was General Saltzman's idea to bring a senior ally. And, that is a point worth making. Although I'm here with a British accent, here wearing a British uniform, actually I'm working on behalf of all of the allies. So it is about that allied integration into US Space Force. I said with Z and the team, we sat down and we came up with 3 lines of effort. The first one being shaping futures. And that is the future of the United States Space Force with allies and partners. And I can talk more about the international partner strategy that we recently released as a sort of deliverable in that line.
Save that.
Yep. The second one is harnessing CSPO. As CSPO is the Combined Space Operations Initiative. So now a 10-nation forum. It started off as Five Eyes about 10 years ago. France and Germany then came on board, and then recently Italy, Norway, and Japan. And actually this morning, we just had what's termed a steering committee for CSPO as well. Started at 0700 here. And you can imagine the global aspects of that, where it was 11 o'clock in the evening in New Zealand, lunchtime in Europe, and so on. So just gathering the groups together technically is difficult, but we had an amazing discussion this morning. And so it's harnessing the power of CSPO to, again, embed allies and partners into where the United States Space Force is going, and as other nations develop their own equivalents as well. And the third one is engaging NATO. And so NATO, actually the UK Space Command, one of the reasons it stood up was because, and many of the other European space commands, is because NATO officially declared space an operational domain in 2019. And so
it was
NATO,
before the Space Force even.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's an element there where as NATO stands up their own space structures, I mentioned CSPO, 7 of those nations are direct NATO members. The other 3 are NATO aligned or partnered members as well. So it just makes sense to be working with NATO as they stand up their space structures, and also ultimately look to the US, who has been doing national security space for decades, to see, what is the gold standard? How do we do this through a number of the different mission areas. So it's basically those three: shaping the future, international partner strategy, harnessing the power of CSPO, that 10-nation forum, and then engaging NATO, which is a 32-nation forum, and empowering allies and partners.
You know, Godders, you're a long way from Kenley and Croydon and the Trinity School, which is clearly a place and time that remains near and dear to you. And here you are, a highly accomplished and decorated fighter pilot, the first commander of Britain's Space Command, an ocean away on the command staff of the U.S. Space Force. So what was it back then that started you on this path? When and why did the light bulb become electrified?
It's an interesting one. You mentioned Kenley, actually, and I grew up next to so RAF Kenley was a World War II fighter base. It was just the other side, another hill along from its more famous, I guess, bigger brother, RAF Biggin Hill. And I loved the whole Battle of Britain thing, you know, and the Battle of Britain was fought out of airfields like Kenley and Biggin Hill. Honestly, one of my earliest memories is, I guess it was 1978, so I would have been 6 years old, going with my parents to an air show at Kenley Air Show and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. You know, my dad built model aeroplanes, hung them in the room that me and my brother shared. And then after that, I remember being picked up by the police, not for doing anything wrong, but because I got lost on Kenley Airdrome looking for stuff to do with the Second World War. So without turning this into too long a story, as soon as I could, when I was at school in Croydon, I joined the cadet force that we had at school, went flying, thought this is the thing for me. And so I ended up joining at 18 years old, because in the UK, you don't have to have a degree to join us. Subsequently got a master's, but went into officer training when I was 18 after I'd finished school, and then pilot training.
I'm going to jump
somehow ended up here.
Let me just jump in real quick, though, because I think it's something that is fascinating and unique to the British experience, right? Because we don't really have air cadets in middle school, which is basically the equivalent. And I do remember seeing, you know, air cadets when I lived in London and when I lived in Battersea in Little India, right? They'd all come streaming out and have, you know, uniforms and go off and did good things and came back and probably learned, you know, many interesting things. So how is that integrated? I mean, how did that shape you and being at Trinity School? I mean, because obviously Trinity School has this program and it's in their school, right?
Yeah, so there's a number of schools back in the UK that have what are called combined cadet forces. So CCF, so you will have an RAF section, a Navy section, an Army section, maybe even as part of the Navy, a Marine section as well.
We want a space section.
Well, so actually in my last job, I was working really closely with the air cadets, because space, although joint, sat under the Royal Air Force. And the Commandant Air Cadets did an amazing job of putting space onto the syllabus for air cadets. And it was amazing to me just the other week. The reason I was back in the United Kingdom was I was hosting and doing various things at the Royal International Air Tattoo at RAF Fairford, an American base in the UK, huge air show. And it was great to go into the tech zone and see so many air cadets talking about space, you know, which is amazing. But an awesome resource, the cadets, you know, you could join at 14. I think I went flying for the first time maybe at 15 years old. You have to get a signature from your parents in terms of recruitment. And even outside of that, the friends that I had who didn't join the military, they learned skills for life when it comes to sort of leadership, confidence, those sorts of things. So honestly, to me, it was an amazing program.
And so, you know, let's fast forward a bit to that experience that being in the Air Cadets really set you up for, right? And please don't misunderstand this next question, because I know that most people will look at your command assignments as the major driver of how you might approach a strategic level assignment or task, because there are a lot of big and complicated parts, right, to guide into place when you are in command. But I kind of wonder about those high fidelity experiences. And what I mean by that is that you have been part of high stakes operations in Iraq, in the Balkans, perhaps also in Cyprus. I wonder if those experiences, which is really where the rubber hits the road, and you know what I'm talking about, right? Where stuff really matters. Have those experiences translated into how you do your work today? And if so, how?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think, especially in aviation, it's an understanding of risk, I think, right at the very baseline, from just learning to fly an aeroplane, knowing the boundaries in which you can fly an aeroplane before it goes out of control. It's the same sort of thing when you are on operations or commanding operations, i.e., how far do you push boundaries remaining in control and conducting the mission, I think is probably the biggest takeaway from those, and it's not about risk avoidance an awful lot of the time. It is about understanding risk and taking deliberate decisions. And actually, that's what I've taken forward into all of the command jobs that I've done, whether it was commanding a station, whether it was commanding UK Space Command. I'm not in a command job now, but yeah, there are certain risks you can take. Hey, do I need to go and ask to go and do this? I'm very much a person who uses the line proceed until apprehended when it comes to getting stuff done. And I think that has really helped in moving strategies forward, getting things done and demonstrating to people that, we can make progress wherever it is. There's always some in the back of my mind, a sort of risk-based approach. At the more simple level, honestly, all of those operations, and I'm so lucky to have ended up doing space, it just demonstrated how critical space is in multi-domain warfare, which is why I'm so passionate about it now.
But you've actually been a customer of space products, so to speak, right? And because you've been a customer of space products, the reason why I'm really interested about that point where, I've said where the rubber hits the road, at the point where people's lives are on the line, there are responsibilities. There's the responsibility of your squadron and the risk of that, and there's also the responsibility of actualizing the mission and creating the effect that you're looking for on the ground. There's that through line, though, that space plays for all of that, where I think you have somewhat, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhat of a special perspective, because you haven't just been driving space assets, you've actually been the space product user.
I remember, I'm guessing it was the late 90s, so flying the Harrier, when we got GPS embedded in the aeroplane for the first time. And honestly, people take it for granted now, but it was a life changer, because before we had these inertial nav systems that you used to have to update through essentially flying over landmarks that you pre-programmed into the system, pressing update and seeing how far it had drifted. And this thing called a Kalman filter would then reposition your nav system, but it was always drifting. So when you needed that nav system, i.e. show me where the target is, the little diamond that you see in your head-up display wouldn't be in the right place if you'd got that wrong. As soon as GPS came along, well, firstly, the diamond was always in the right place, so it made precision so much easier. Secondly, we had it embedded onto the weapons that we were using. And you see that writ large in all of the operations around the world at the moment, which comes to, you talked about risk to life, those sorts of things. When you can reduce collateral damage to that point, where you're in within a meter or two of your intended target, that is amazing. And we know, most of us know, it's still easily forgotten, but that is provided by position, navigation, and timing, and from the US and most Western nations through the GPS constellation. So yeah, having been a customer of this, I understand the importance, and I understand the importance with the threat to the potential threat to those systems in the space from potential adversaries who have got all sorts of systems up there. And I know what it's like if that gets taken away from us. And that's why I'm passionate about this, because I don't want that to happen.
Now, you recently released the U.S. Space Force's International Partnership Strategy. It's got 3 goals and 3 lines of effort. Love all the 3s. It's always that way. But they're all under the moniker of strength through partnerships. It's got details about who's responsible for what, but what's the impetus for this strategy? What is it supposed to do? And who is it actually for?
Well, it's an interesting question because when you sit down and write a strategy, always the first question is, or if you write anything, I guess you as a journalist, your first question is, who's the audience? And obviously there are multiple audiences for this strategy. Firstly, the United States Space Force, because you will have seen, and we thought long and hard about this, there are some what we term specified tasks in there. So there are, I think it's 15 or 18 tasks that are in that strategy that just by virtue of the fact the CSO has signed off, those people annotated in there are going to have to deliver those tasks. So there's a United States Space Force audience. There's the allied audience as well. Just by releasing a strategy and CSO with his signature on that 14-page document demonstrates how the United States Space Force is prioritizing international partnerships. And we hope, and I've had some good feedback, that it brings clarity to the allies. Because when you, and I've experienced this, when you look across to the broader US space enterprise, when you think there's the intelligence community, the service, combatant command, and everything in between, it is complex. And thirdly, I think in terms of audience, and we've got industry in there, commercial, because this nests with the commercial space strategy as well.
Has to really, because so many of our systems in the products sometimes come through commercial systems, right?
Yeah,
like
100%.
Communication. So
ultimately, it's about hybrid space architectures at the end of the day, which is about deterrence and it's about resilience. So you can imagine that final piece of the audience puzzle is actually the adversary. So, for them to look at us and see how we are collaborating with a number of like-minded nations, which if at the end of the day, it forces someone to reconsider an action they might take because there's a number of people working together, a coalition of the willing in space, then that has to be a good thing. It's back to that deterrent point.
So then how far will these partnerships go, you think? We have DARC, for instance, right? That fits perfectly into this strategy. It's the Deep Space Advanced Radar capability. It leverages AUKUS, which is pretty clear, even though it doesn't say that exactly, but duh.
It's a geographic AUKUS.
Right, it's a geographic AUKUS. But it's an observational or space domain intelligence gathering type of capability, right? But let's say, would a nation like yours, for instance, consider fielding capabilities that it would go into this partnership, into the strategy, that have capabilities that are on orbit, that are maneuverable, like, let's say, inspectors or something even perhaps more aggressive that could provide, a harder deterrent?
You know what? So I think the really interesting thing right now is the US Space Force is 5.5 years old. It's only 5.5 years old. But what we're seeing now is some doctrine documents come out, the operational frameworks coming out, which is great because when you consider, I think France were the first non-U.S. nation to stand up a space command, and that was 2019, 2020.
That was actually before the U.S. Space Force as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was before NATO declared space a domain. It was a direct result of the fact that I think it was Olymp-K, which is a Russian satellite, was basically going around and harassing some of their geosynchronous communication satellites.
100%. So you've got all of these space commands standing up, and then there was sort of a daisy chain effect after that of allied space commands standing up. And they're all 3 to 5 years in. So this is perfect timing right now to look at, so the three sort of time horizons, if you like, force design. Where are the gaps in our architecture based on the threat in the future? Can the allies fill that architecture? What are they doing themselves? How are they building up their own industrial bases? Force development, which is more sort of training and education, wargaming, those sorts of things.
Cadets,
all of that stuff. How do we leverage that together? Do we have common lexicon? How are we using NATO in terms of standards agreements and STANAGs so that we're interoperable in space? I won't mention it now, maybe come back to me on sort of data links in the 90s. And then there's force employment. How are we going to operate together? That's why Actually, this morning in the CSPO conversation we had, U.S. Space Command representing Operation Olympic Defender, a named space operation with currently Five Eyes plus France and Germany. So it is across that entire spectrum. So you ask, what sort of capabilities?
And the EU's got a bank account now, so to speak. I mean, they want to bankroll this. And yes, I understand that the UK did Brexit. Nevertheless, they've come around and they have been starting pretty serious discussions about political military alliances. So there is a drumbeat of both the continent as well as the UK spending more on their defense. And space would be a really big part of that because it is supposed to go into new technologies that are going to be more efficient. And without space, you're just not going to have that. So yeah, that's why I'm wondering, maybe Britain could be more active and have its own sort of satellites as opposed to just being an observational point.
And that's exactly it.
And that's why, I'm trying to tap into the fighter pilot in you, right?
Yeah, so, and this was my job in as the commander of U.K. Space Command so what are we going to build from a U.K. perspective? And fundamentally, there's two questions you have to ask. One, what does the U.K. military need? Two, how do we add value to the United States and everything that brings to national security space? Because clearly the U.S., as I mentioned before, has been doing this for decades. Space has always been highly classified as well, in a stovepipe. And what this does is breaking down those barriers so that we do understand what technologies exist, what our own militaries require in terms of enablement. And also, and you started alluding to it there, how do you A, see, B, defend against the threats that are appearing in space? So there's a lot of nations looking at inspector satellites. I think that's always the first step, understanding what is going on up there before you then take the next step and potentially, look into, as I say, how do you deny that first mover advantage? How do you defend against the threats that are out there right now? So, this is why I love this, because it is fascinating. It is enormously complex. When you get into, you just mentioned there, European Union, as well as NATO, as well as individual countries. And that's just in a small European North Atlantic area, when inherently space is global. So you can't really break this up into the Indo-Pacific and, European theaters, because in low Earth orbit, you're covering all of those in a sort of 90-minute orbit.
I was just following the money, man. Right. But to go with that, I also wonder, well, what about India? What about an African nation? We have at least two African nations that I can think of off the top of my head, Nigeria being one. I believe the other is Angola, that have signed the Artemis Accords, for instance, along with Britain, right? Is this partnership strategy for them as well?
Yeah. So this is the thing. It is understanding who we prioritize in terms of speaking to people. And this is where, so just to, let you behind the curtain a little bit, the United States Space Force has their components in the major combatant commands. So Space Forces Europe, Africa, Space Forces Indo-PACOM, Space Forces Central. And I think what we want to try and do in this strategy is just give some level of prioritization, some commander's intent, if you like, the areas that we want them to concentrate on, and then allow those component commands to go out there and go and speak to all of these people, go to a African space conference and see what is out there, see how people can help, see what alignment we've got with various people, feed that back into the headquarters and the various combatant commands as well, because remember the geographic combatant commands, EUCOM, CENTCOM, Indo-PACOM, and then we'll develop a strategy for that particular nation. So it's a kind of feedback loop where we start with prioritization, mission command, we let the guys and girls get on with it, there's a feedback loop, and then we reassess so that we are deliberately building, as I say, a hybrid space architecture of the future rather than kind of letting this happen accidentally or being reactive to things that are happening.
Then maybe another way of looking at this is that another one of your audiences are actually the COCOMs,
Yeah, 100%. And it won't surprise you to learn that, we're not just doing this internally from the United States Space Force perspective. When we pull together a workshop to look at force design, then we'll absolutely invite the planning individuals. Normally they're called the fives, the J5s or the S5s from various places.
Perspective,
so
yes.
that everyone understands what aims and objectives are, and we're not coming up with differing aims and objectives when it comes to the geographic areas around the world. So again, you can see the complexity of this, and we're just trying to boil it down into some level of simplicity so that we can get at you mentioned the threes, we can get towards those enduring objectives along those sort of three lines of effort of create, integrate, and operate.
Now, we are running out of time. I know that, but
It's a shame. We need to book more.
We do need to book more. I'm going to throw something at you real quick because I just think it really needs to be answered and, be as efficient as you want. But you have the words future concepts as part of the name of your staff position here. And just to remind everyone, Goddard is the Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships, right? So we've just kind of really dug into the partnerships part. But future concepts has a different sort of meaning, at least in my mind and a lot of folks that I speak with, because they equate that with preparing for conflict at least 5, 10, 15 years out, but also 15 or even 30 or even 40 years out into the future. They even employ tools like strategic foresight, right, to consider the possible futures and what we'll need to do now to be prepared for strategic surprise or technological surprise. And there are rumors that Futures Command will be coming online soon, perhaps in the autumn. But what does Future Concepts, that part of your office title here, what does it actually mean? Because I feel that maybe there's a disconnect. And if we could, I'd like to take this opportunity to demystify that.
Yeah, so interestingly, to me, it's a connection, rather than a disconnect. So the future concepts, it's about that intersection of future concepts with allies and partners and the futures team within the United States Space Force. So those people that are future gazing, that are looking at architectures, space and ground architectures of the future. If it's going to be hybrid, if it's going to be allied, if it's going to be commercial, you've got to understand those sorts of things. So for me, certainly initially, we're looking at this office being the sort of entry point, if you like. I hesitate to use the word front door because I think Space Systems Command has got an amazing front door system.
But that front door is mostly for a domestic audience and for domestic commercial players, right? You're talking about a front door to the United States, and that's without immigration and customs.
Correct. So I have got a visa, by the way.
Okay, good, because I'd have to check.
But but it's exactly that. So that future concepts is tied to the partnerships aspect of it. So it is where those future concepts with allies and partners come together. Because you can imagine as well, there are plenty of allies and partners out there, and something significant that I always knew, but it really hit me when I got here, was budget size. So, as I arrived last year, a $30 billion budget for the United States Space Force, which when you look at the size of the problem, is it going to increase in the future? When I looked at my budget, as I flew across the pond, it was 100 million a year, not 30 billion, 100 million. Now, I see a lot of raised eyebrows when people hear that, and it is prevalent across most of the nations out there because they've only just stood up their space commanders and space commanders equivalent. But it does mean that those allied space commanders are all considering what is the most efficient use of my relatively large, in other nations, budget. How do I best use that money? And more often than not, they come up with some really good solutions to difficult problems. That you have to think your way around it rather than just sort of blast it with money. And I think and I'm not saying the United States does that in the slightest. There's some unbelievable thinking that comes on here. And I think where that future concepts comes in is giving us the forum so that allies can pitch the sort of concepts that they're coming up with, and for us collectively to determine, okay, is that something that we do together going forward? So you can see there's a number of different areas in that future concepts, but I'm most definitely not any potential futures command, but I think it is working with Task Force Futures to understand how allies and partners play into this in the future.
And just to wrap up this fantastic conversation, what is the future concept for Air Marshal Paul Godfrey? What's your concept of your future?
Well, so me personally, this is a 3-year tour. So you're stuck with me for at least another couple of years, which gives me time to implement this strategy. That I'll be proud of. What I do know, me personally, whether the Royal Air Force has another job for me, whether NATO has a job for me, I hope you hear it, I'm incredibly passionate about space because we've got such a long way to go in terms of educating the general population, educating militaries, educating politicians as to the importance of space, the fragility of space. And so I definitely want to continue on this space journey in whatever capacity that I can. But I'm hopeful that I can do it from the inside, if you like. And, you know, it is a real privilege and an honor to be sat here in the Pentagon, to be sat here as part of the United States Space Force, to be sat here talking to you about such an important subject, having just released the International Partner Strategy. So there's definitely some short-term goals. I'll sit maybe and think more about the long-term goals when this particular ride finishes.
Godders, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the Downlink podcast.
Thanks, Laura. It's been a real pleasure.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.